Well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn research seminar on the Embedding Culture in Child-Focused Practice for Multicultural Children in Care. My name's Maren Butler and I'm a Director in Family and Community Services Insights, Analysis and Research, also known as FACSIAR, within the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we're joining today's webinar from across New South Wales, we're living and working on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. I would like to personally acknowledge the Darramurrugal people, who are the owners and First Nations people of the area where I have the privilege of joining from today. I'd like to pay my respects to all First Nations elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. I'd also like to warmly welcome all the webinar participants that we have with us. We've had a great response to this webinar with over 950 people registered, which shows the great interest and importance of this session. Today's Lunch and Learn webinar will focus on children's cultural identities. Children's cultural identities shape their wellbeing, connections, and sense of belonging. In today's webinar, we have Professor Rebekah Grace and Kathy Karatasas from Transforming Early Education and Child Health, TeEACH, at Western Sydney University, who will unpack the C4 framework, children, care, community and culture, and demonstrate how these elements work together to strengthen cultural responsiveness across early intervention, child protection and out-of-home care settings. The webinar will also explore the 5 R's of practice: reflexive, respectful, relational, reciprocal and real, and introduce the self model, which supports deeper understanding of a child's and family's migration journey, identity, language and faith. Teresa Chen, a representative from Youth Consult for Change, will provide practical ways that frontline workers can think about culture when working with multicultural children in care. Following these presentations, a panel will explore practice implications and share real-world examples to support implementation. The session will be recorded and posted on our FACSIAR webpage, and anyone who's registered for the webinar will receive the link to the recording within a week. Now, we've got a busy session today, so we'll move quickly to introducing our presenters and panellists. So Professor Rebekah Grace is the Director of the Centre for Transforming Early Education and Child Health at Western Sydney University. Her disciplinary background is in child development, and she is committed to addressing inequities experienced by children and families. Rebekah leads a large program of research embedded within multiple complex service environments, involving cross-disciplinary collaboration and partnerships with practitioners, community organisations and community members. She has made a significant contribution to the field as this relates to applying a strengths-based approach in research and practice and examining the effectiveness of models of collaboration and integration to support children with complex needs. Kathy Karatasas has over 40 years' experience across statutory and oversight agencies delivering child and family services, including child protection, early intervention, adolescent and women's health and permanency care. She advocates for improved sector practice supporting children and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Kathy leads CulturalWorks cultural consultation, partnering with organisations to strengthen culturally responsive practice, leadership and strategy in foster care. She is a PhD candidate with TeEACH at Western Sydney University and a Churchill Fellow who studied cultural care practices. We also have Teresa Chen. Teresa Chen is a UC Change representative and has been in this role since June 2024. As a UC Change member, Teresa advocates for policy change on a macro level and makes recommendations to improve practice. Teresa is also currently in her 4th year of a double Bachelor of Social Work with Honours and Bachelor of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Marg Stott is a registered psychologist and manager of practice and implementation at Ozchild. She has extensive experience in implementation science, specialising in translating evidence into practical, usable approaches and embedding quality assurance processes to sustain high quality practice over time. And Ghassan Nujaim is the head of the Multicultural Child and Family Program at Settlement Services International, with over 24 years' experience across child protection, out-of-home care, and community development in both government and non-government sectors. He is recognised for his leadership in culturally responsive practice, innovation, and continuous quality improvement, and has led the development of initiatives such as My Life and Me Cultural Life Story Workbook. Ghassan is an accredited family group conferencing facilitator, Building Stronger Family facilitator, TLSW practitioner, and has received multiple awards for excellence and innovation in child and family services. So welcome everybody, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this important webinar. And I'm now going to hand over to Rebekah to start.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Merrin, and such a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for having us. If it's okay, I'd just like to add my own acknowledgement of country. I love to put this painting up. It's actually a painting by one of my PhD students called Bradley Burns, who's a Kamilaroi man who's doing his own lovely research around Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. But he painted this image, and it's intended to capture the idea that when we all sit together and share our ideas and bring our perspectives and our voice, and when we share those together, that we achieve a lot more together, and we're so much better informed when we hear and listen to each other. So I love that picture, and I just think it's so relevant to what we're talking about today. We are going to share some of the findings of our research study, and of course research studies always happen in teams, and so before we go any further, we need to acknowledge the people who were part of the research team that conducted this work. And as you can see, it was quite a large team, and there are 4 different universities represented as part of that team. One of our most cherished colleagues, Professor Manjula Wanaganaiki, was one of the important founders of this research project, and she passed away during the course of this research. So we miss her, but honour her contribution and the thinking and the wisdom that she brought to the shaping and the analysis of this work. We also had 8 partner organisations, so 8 sector partners. We're always very keen in the work that we do to ensure that whatever we're doing is going to be meaningful to those who are working in real world practice settings, and so very grateful for the contribution of these organisations and for their guidance all along the way with this research. So we started on our journey. We were fortunate enough to receive funding from the Australian Research Council, which was really lovely. And we had 3 questions that we were really focused on. We knew, as a background, we knew that there had been not a lot of research internationally or in Australia around children from multicultural backgrounds. And so we wanted to fill some of that gap. We had been conscious by our engagement with our service partners that everybody was looking to do the very best that they could to support children from multicultural backgrounds, but they were doing this in the absence of a lot of research or guidance. So this was our mission, to fill this gap and to really look at what was happening in that space. So our very first research question was around current policy and practices. We were looking at the landscape, what is actually happening for multicultural children in care. And we wanted to hear from policymakers, from children themselves, from foster and kinship carers, and also from birth parents around current practice and policy and their thinking around what was strong and what could be improved in that space. Our second research question was around promising practices. So what's already happening that is serving children well? We're particularly interested in life story work, in cultural care planning, of course, and also in cultural mentoring and the role of cultural mentoring in supporting the cultural connection and identity of multicultural children in care. So we did quite an in-depth study looking at those particular practices. And then our third research question was, what would an exemplary model of care look like? You know, how can we take all that we have learnt, all that has been shared with us, and translate that into something that will serve practitioners and serve service organisations and support, quality care for multicultural children. So that was really our mission, to contribute in this way. We were fortunate enough to speak to 65 policymakers across every state of Australia in focus groups, which was, a wonderful, rich source of data. We spoke to 34 children who were aged between 5 and 18 years, who are children with multicultural backgrounds in the out-of-home care sector. We spoke to 33 carers, 10 birth family members, and 76 practitioners. So our study holds that data as core, I guess, in terms of our research and our thinking. We're very guided by, what we were told in those interviews and sessions. This work matters. I think to summarise, there are 3 reasons why this work is really important. The first one is a rights argument. So we know that cultural connection is the right of every child. It's very clear in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that every child has the right to be raised within their own traditions and within their cultural values, including children in care. It's a right of all children. And as far as I understand, within that convention, there are no rights that trump other rights. All rights are important and are to be upheld. So I know in the out-of-home care sector, it's very easy to feel that the right to safety will trumps all others. But I think what this convention would encourage us to see, that of course, the right to safety should be upheld for children, but so should, the other rights, including their right to cultural connection. So we were starting very much from a position of a commitment to the importance of taking all of those rights seriously, and this right seriously, and ensuring that it's embedded in practice and characterises the care experience of all children, including multicultural children. We also know there's quite a large body of child development research that is clear in pointing to the connection between cultural connection and child well-being. So we know that culture is protective. We know that for children in out-of-home care, there are a high risk of poor outcomes as the result of adversity that they've experienced within their life. And we know that protective factors can be incredibly impactful in terms of mitigating some of the impact of that adversity. So, that protective element of culture is just so important, and perhaps nowhere more important than for children who experience significant adversity. And then the third reason why we think this work is really important is because culture and understanding of culture helps to keep children connected to their birth families. And sometimes that can happen. Hopefully that can happen as much as possible while children are in care, and that it can be binding and tie them and help them to feel a sense of belonging with their birth family. Sometimes it happens later in adulthood when there's opportunity for reconnection with family, but culture can be key to opening the door to those forms of connection and that relationship building and feeling like children belong with their families. So those are the reasons we think that this work is really, really important. Kathy, I think I'm going to hand over to you to take over for a little bit.
Thanks, Rebekah. So in terms of how the research was undertaken, we looked at the policy. As Rebekah said, we ran a series of focus groups with representatives, senior representatives from organisations, as well as multicultural experts. And we know that in out-of-home care, unfortunately, there are still large numbers of children in care. And we know we have a better details of the numbers of children of Indigenous background. And unfortunately, they are also a very high proportion. 44% of children in care are from Indigenous backgrounds. That's recorded, and we know that in our system. What we don't know and we don't have is data on the other children's cultural background. So we know out of the 56% of children who are in care who are not identified as First Nations, we do not know what their cultural backgrounds are. And so it makes it difficult to attend to children's cultural care needs and their connections when we don't know what those details are. Thank you. So in terms of looking at what the policy says or what's the guidance in addition to United Nations rights, we spoke to stakeholders to try and understand what guides people in terms of understanding that children's cultural care and being able to support the practice of attending to children's cultures. And we found a few key points. The one point that was very resonant is that this concept that we use in Australia and not internationally of cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds, that umbrella term is something we use in Australia to guide primarily service providers' knowledge and awareness of how to respond and identify to people's multicultural backgrounds. But that concept cold masks the details of children's identities. So it's an umbrella term that can help service providers think about children's cultural backgrounds, but it lacks details of what those profiles are or what the elements are in the definitions of children's cultures. Consistently, there was recognition and evidence in pockets of good practice that the responsibility of attending to children's cultural care when they're supported by the out-of-home care services is shared by both birth family members and carers and practitioners. So there was a sense that there is a responsibility to honour children's cultural care, but what that responsibility looks like varies. The nuances of that term cold was also really clear. We don't know how to respond to children's cultural care when we're not having a shared or an agreed to understanding, whether that's an agreed to understanding across practitioners and within organisations or an agreed understanding with children themselves or with carers or with birth parents. And there was opportunity in all to learn from the work that is improving with our First Nations children. All the legislation across all the states allows for cultural care connections and attention to children's cultural care for First Nations children. Best interest is the reference in the legislation that refers to children's, as Rebekah said before, around all their wellbeing. But the specific attention to multicultural children's cultural care is lacking consistently across all the states. New South Wales and Western Australia are the only states that draw that attention in a clearer way.
Do you want to move
Yeah,
on?
that'd be great. Thanks. Okay. So as Rebekah said, we interviewed and we sought the views of children and young people, birth parents, carers and practitioners. What was really interesting around the views of children and young people, noting that their age range varied from as young as 5 to 18. Their cultural care was evident in their routines and the way that they were able to describe how they attended school, how they saw their family, what they did in terms of their play and in terms of their relationship with their carers. Consistently, carers were seen as the anchors who guided children's routines on a day-by-day basis. But there were some clear differences that came up from children's views. Children were really clear that they value trust and they know what an authentic and an honest and a real relationship looks like. They could pick that out in terms of the conversations they had with different people that came into their lives. So the concept of what's truthful and how that was reflected in their relationships with their friends, as well as relationships with carers and practitioners, was a constant. They valued that and they called that out in their experiences with caseworkers who in conversations may be using terminology like cultural care plans and life story work and let's look at your cultural connections. There were 6 out of all the children that we interviewed who used the language that practitioners use, i.e. they talked about cultural care plan and life story work. That language and that terminology is not language that children were familiar with, and shouldn't be in terms of those labels, in my view. And so when they met caseworkers who wanted to speak about these concepts or these practices, they could see that they felt like a project. They didn't feel like it was a relationship that was meaningful, and intended to help and focus on the children's experience. So that children were really clear about genuinely valuing relationships and not wanting to be seen as part of a transaction or way that the caseworkers were ticking off an activity that practitioners saw as a compliance. And consistently, older children were able to articulate the value of culture and the meaning of culture to themselves. So as they moved into those older years of being 17 and 18, repeatedly they talked about how important culture is to their lifestyle, to who they are, their sense of identity, their sense of belonging. That ability to translate that meaning wasn't shared consistently in the same language of children of a younger age. And the older children also were able to say, if you asked me when I was 10, did I value culture? I probably would answer it in a different way to how I answer it as I get older. So if we're expecting children to be able to articulate their views around how important culture is, it's the concept of thinking about age and stage and development and articulation is important for us to be thinking about. Thank you. In terms of the views of the parents, I had the joy and the privilege of interviewing parents, and there was a breadth of views expressed from parents from multicultural backgrounds. It's similarly to the concept of culturally and linguistically diverse, they aren't an umbrella group that have very similar views in everything. There's a lot of differences that were expressed by individual parents. That said, they also shared views that many other birth parents whose children are in care may also express around the concept of feeling powerless and not being able to control or to influence their children's care. But there were a number of key themes that came out. One was the fear and the worry around children losing practices and routines and rituals that were important to them in their family before the children came into care. Whether it's a ritual around using particular language terms, a ritual around faith practice, the loss of those rituals in the new care environment was something the parents noticed and worried about as a contributing factor to possibly losing care. Cultural connections. Parents valued life story work. They wanted to know not only how to share that information for children, but also they wanted it for themselves in the transition from being able to care for their children on a day-by-day basis to not being present and observing the rituals and the milestones of children's day-to-day care. They called out for having a life story work of that sort of shape for themselves. They wanted to be spoken to respectfully and consistently. That came up in the way conversations with practitioners may have misinterpreted or come across as culturally insensitive in the interpretations practitioners may have had of the language and the expression of birth parents. So culturally sensitive assessments and the concept of being spoken to and communicating in a respectful way was highlighted by birth parents. And a number of them called out for support people to be a voice and to provide them with that peer support, working together with other parents of similar circumstances or agencies who could take on a mentoring role or a leadership role with the conversations with sector representatives was something that was also called out by birth parents. To help them adjust with their loss of being able to be full-time carers, as well as navigating what that new parenting role looks like as ongoing people involved in their children's lives.
Thanks. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of our findings from the interviews with foster and kinship carers. There were some key themes that we want to highlight with you today. And the first is around a common question, is it my role as their carer to provide this cultural connection and support cultural identity? I think there were some really interesting conversations and some really interesting and very genuine questions asked and issues discussed. So, carers wondered, is it in fact disrespectful for me to engage in this space? If I step into this cultural space and I don't feel that I've been invited to, am I being inappropriate? Who does provide all of this practical support? What do I do if I don't know anything about this culture? Is it better for me to not do anything at all than to risk doing the wrong thing or messing this up in some way? So lots of questions from the carers around their role in that space. The second key theme was around cultural threads and cultural fabrics. What we're talking about there is that carers and families, of course, were often balancing lots of cultural influences within a household. So they may have been from a culturally diverse background themselves, or, there may have been more than one foster child, or be married, or, be partnered with somebody who's from a different cultural background. So how to balance all of the different kind of cultural influences and experiences and priorities within a house was a really challenging thing for many carers. There were also lots of questions and conversations about the role that the child plays in their own cultural connection and that intersection with child development and interest. So we had many carers, for example, say, well, I'm looking after a young child. This child's only 4, so I don't see this as a priority until they get older. So there were comments like that, but also comments around interest. So, do I pursue this? Do I, seek connection and take this child to cultural events when they seem to show so little interest themselves in this cultural background? Or perhaps their biological parents don't show a lot of interest in the cultural background. So, how do I fit in here, and who leads the way? Whose responses, should guide mine? And what do I do if they're just not interested? So there were those kinds of conversations, and carers were really looking for practical guidance and accurate information. That was another thing that came up under that heading. So we had some really fascinating stories about carers who'd been given cultural information about a child to find out down the track that information was in fact not correct. So I think one of my favourite stories was favorite because it's just sort of, I guess, an extreme example. But a family had been told that the young child they were caring for was Russian, had a Russian background, and this caring family threw themselves into learning all about Russian culture. They started learning Russian, teaching the child Russian language as they were growing, eating Russian food, listening to Russian music. They were able to identify themselves a Russian community mentor that was working with the family and with the child. They were absolutely exemplary in the way that they, pursued this understanding and connection to find out a couple of years down the track that the child, in fact, did not have a Russian background and had an Anglo-Australian background. So lots of stories of misinformation and confusion and wanting really practical and real help and advice. And then I was going to touch as well on some of the themes that were coming back from the caseworkers that we spoke to. Caseworkers described valuing culture and seeing it as a priority, but feeling under such pressure and feeling they had such a long list of things that they were needing to manage that they felt like it was something that had to be piled on top of an already busy schedule, and that was difficult. They also asked questions about whose responsibility it is. Is this the responsibility of the carer? What is my responsibility here? They asked for better and more accurate cultural information, like carers. They're also feeling like they didn't have all the information they needed. And they were certainly looking for stronger community partnerships and lots of thinking about how to form those and to find those connections.
Oops.
So as a result of all of this data and all of the thinking that we did, and of course, married with the research literature that already exists and our discussion with experts, we developed a model that we're calling the C4 Multicultural Practice model. And it's called the C4 model because there are 4 concepts that underpin this model, and they all start with C, which is a good memory prompt. And so the first concept that underpins this model is around children and child-centered practice. We argue that children are central to all interactions, or should be central to all interactions and decision-making, and that it's the child's interest and developmental stage that should guide the decisions that the people around them make in terms of connection to culture and identity. Just as a note, we argue that there's no age at which culture is not important. So it just shapes the way those conversations have and the sorts of activities that might be engaged with. But culture should be an open door, and a door that is always open, and then it's up to the child whether or not they'd like to step through that door. But our job as the adults around them is to keep those doors open for them. So child-centered practice, child-led interest. The next concept we've called care. This is very much about relationships or caring for each other. We argue for the importance of actively investing in strong and nurturing relationships. These are not only relationships with the child, but also relationships between and with caregivers, birth families, community members. The importance of all of those relationships in providing and building a community around a child. And we know that building caring relationships takes time and patience and persistence. So, it's something we talk about care, we talk about relationships as if that's an easy thing to do, but we know that there's very deliberate investment required and action required to keep those relationships strong, and yet they're so critical to good outcomes for children. The third C is community. So we know, as Kathy's mentioned, that children learn from the routines of their life. They learn from watching the people around them, and they learn from being included in the ways of doing things. So it is critical that we build cultural communities around children. These communities can be made up of siblings and extended family members, not always necessarily just parents. Carers and caseworkers can be part of these communities, even if they don't share the culture of their child. They can be the information gatherers and the facilitators as part of these communities. We know that religious groups and sports teams and language groups and all sorts of other opportunities within the community exist as starting points to start to really build that cultural community around a child. Then our last important C as an underlying concept is, of course, culture. And this is about culture being unique to every individual child. It's often much more complex than one culture or one cultural label and the assumptions that sit behind a cultural label. We know that language and settlement journey and all sorts of elements influence the culture of a child. And Kathy's going to talk to that in a little more detail in just a little while. And then we have our 5 practice principles, and conveniently they all start with an R. So we've tried to make it very easy for people to remember these things, and for us to remember them too. So we argue there are 5 practice principles that are part of this model, and in our resources around this model, we unpack these, of course. We see culture as being woven into everyday practice, not as an add-on. We call for reflexive culture. This is all about being open to new learning, shifting our own views, being willing to shift our own views and our own behaviours as we reflect on whatever assumptions and perspectives and biases we might be bringing to any of these conversations and interactions. We argue for the importance of respectful practice, of valuing what's important to others, even if it's not what we would prioritise. It's about listening. It's about being intentional and recognising the power imbalances that exist and the potential impacts of those power imbalances. So being very aware of those things. We argue that good practice is relational, that relationship consistency and continuity is absolutely critical. So again, it's about that investment in those relationships. We also think that reciprocity, or being reciprocal, is an important practice principle, because this is all about humility and the recognition that we learn from each other. I guess it references back to that painting that Bradley Burns that I put up at the beginning, that we're stronger when we come with humility, when we listen to each other and we seek to learn from each other. So this is about having the humility to both share and seek out new learning around culture. And then our last practice principle there is about being real. This is about genuine curiosity, engagement without judgment or agenda. And it's about looking at and understanding things as they are rather than as we would like them to be. So, for example, if a child is not interested in attending a cultural event, we can respect that rather than feeling we need to tell them that they really should be interested in attending this event. So it's about seeing things for what they are and being respectful in that space.
Thank you. We're going okay for time? Yep.
So yeah, at this stage. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of the self-cultural framework, this is a framework that has evolved over many years of practice, and Ghassan Nugent was also involved in this, as we have worked to review and reflect on how can we shift the practice that talks about cultural connections and cultural matching. I noticed there were some questions around cultural matching in the chat. The concept of cultural and linguistically diverse, for me, doesn't provide much meaning in terms of what that means. It actually includes terminology like culture and in terms of terminology around language. We struggled over the years to try and understand, when we were looking at cultural matching, what in fact are we actually matching? And are we all talking about culture in the same way? So over the years, we've explored to what extent culture looked at something about tradition, or did it look at language, or did it look at faith? And my experience and our experiences over the years highlighted that there are 4 common elements that underlie what culture means when we're looking at multicultural children. And these 4 elements collectively, if you explore them in using the approach of curiosity and understanding each child's unique experiences, can provide a way forward to understand what culture might mean for this particular child at this particular stage in their lives. The 4 elements, the settlement journey, ethnicity, language, and faith, are 4 key prompts that collectively, if you think about them and consider them, place us in a better way to A, understand what culture might mean for children, and B, to understand what approaches we might take to support connections and relationships and experiences for children. The settlement journey is a complex approach and varies for many, many people. There's an inference that it stops at a particular point in time. The Commonwealth approach in its policy suggests that the first 5 years are the 5 years of settlement. But settlement questions around the settlement process and the settlement journey can provide us with information about this particular family's history, about their choice around what was why they came to Australia. Was it one that they chose to do as a migrant, or was it one that they felt forced to do, where they were seeking out seeking out refuge? It asks us to think about what was life for them and the circumstances around before they came to Australia. Where were they living? What were their circumstances before they came? And what were their circumstances when they arrived? We know experiences with people in the first few years of building community connections, learning language, unpacking expectations, learning the rules of the Australian community can influence how families adjust to the norms and the laws and the rules of the new community. So exploring what the settlement journey, how long people have been here, what their experiences have been, can provide some sense of understanding children's what culture might mean. The other element around ethnicity seeks to explore the concepts of traditions and elements of race and the social activities that can be connected to a family's country of origin. So the cultural heritage and the cultural practices that were important historically, or that may still be important for families. So it unpacks questions or seeks to guide the questions around those traditions that are connected to a country of origin. The SELF framework also provides through questions, and the questions we use a series of 10 prompt questions in the guide, but you can certainly build on them and expand on them with the lens of curiosity. But essentially the focus on language not only helps unpack to what extent a non-English speaking language may be important, but it also can unpack what are the nuances between language, both in English and in other languages, that might be important to families. Terminology has evolved and evolves over time. Terminology can be varied across different regions. So the language that might be important to a child or to a parent or to a carer are worth exploring in unpacking and understanding, again, how to explore culture and understand what it might mean to children and families. And that can help build that relationship that we were talking about. And think about what else might be important for the child to be exposed to. Language, as Rebekah mentioned, we don't believe that cultural connections are guided by any particular age. And for young children in particular, exposure to music may be a meaningful way to help a child connect to their culture. And faith refers to the spirituality and the religion and the practices that are connected to faith that may be important to a particular family. To date, our practices and our data have tended to be ad hoc across those 4 elements. Some of our data looks at ethnicity and language, some of it looks at it by way of faith, but consistently those 4 elements are not measured in a way that can help us better understand and have a shared understanding of what cultural issues or what cultural identity factors may be important to children, families and carers.
Kathy, we are running a little short of time because, we've still got to get to the other presenters. And we've got 20 minutes left. Thanks.
So essentially, the model looks at a series of curiosity questions around the 4 C's and the principles, using the SELF framework to guide those questions. And it focuses both on the key stakeholders, as we know, children, parents, carers and practitioners, but also focuses on building relationships with community members, as well as agency representatives and people who have oversight of the sector. And the questions in the guide unpack, as I said, details are using the SELF framework, the 4 C's and the principles, and provides guidance around curiosity questions that can be used or others that can be shaped. I think we've covered that probably in terms of strengthening cultural care in practice.
Okay.
So I think the evidence is growing around how this model can be really helpful. I think it's important to look at how we progress and implement this. We feel really strongly and importantly that it needs to be a collaboration. It doesn't just sit with one sector. It doesn't just sit with carers or practitioners. And the model's strength is a way it can be woven into current practices that organisations use, their practice frameworks, and be used to complement work around home visits, around family visits and supervision and training, to strengthen and reshift the way that we have conversations and explore children's cultures. So I think
we're done.
I'm sorry I'm rushing that last bit, but I'm mindful. There's a whole lot of resources there, and the resources that are online on the FACSIAR website. And there's a number of them that are also currently under publication. So that's the first chunk of papers that have been published around policy, around carers, around the sense of cultural alignment in homes when carers and birth families' cultures are different. Teresa, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your attendance today. Look, I'm here today to share some of my insights and reflections, which are drawn from my experience as someone with a lived experience of out-of-home care. So we'll just get started quickly. Where do you start with strengthening cultural practice, and where do you start with looking at your own practice? I think number one, that starts with an intentional and consistent approach. As a child and even as adults now, we don't know how to deliberately do culture. That's not something people really do. And I think when you start with a bit of a shaky foundation, that leads to disengagement further on from either the child or their carers. So if we, as a little kind of theoretical exercise, if we reflect on our own culture, and that's under number one on the slides, that's often a challenging enough exercise for adults with, years of life experience in the workforce who have had opportunities to develop interpersonal relationships throughout their life. Children and young people in care haven't had these opportunities yet, so they might find it a bit more difficult to conceptualize what their culture looks like. And this might develop and look like having sensitive conversations, maybe conversations around mental health in a cultural context and their understanding of that. An approach developed on this consistency and trust between different people creates a foundation to be able to strengthen this practice. And looking at number two, we need to understand nuances. The emergence of identity in children and young people isn't linear, particularly for those children and young people in out-of-home care who might have experienced a lot of trauma throughout their life. And this sounds obviously, it's often something that's said, but culture doesn't equal religion and vice versa. And to bring in the concept of spirituality that was touched in the previous presentation. But someone's religion might contribute to their culture and vice versa. Different facets of each aspect contribute to the formation of our identities as children, as young people, and as adults as well. Your experience personally or relationship with someone from a particular culture might look different to that child or young person's experience. They might have had a fractured, non-linear emergence of their cultural identity. So looking at this slide, everyone's got a different role to play. Foster carers become carers for different reasons, whether that looks like drawing from their personal values, their religious convictions, or anything else. And this diversity obviously strengthens the pool of carers available. But these perspectives can also shape how carers understand the purpose of care, discipline, identity, or connection to culture. Sometimes this looks like unintentionally that children and young people end up sitting in the middle, explaining the system to carers, defending decisions or managing mismatched expectations. For me personally, this looks like a pressure to maintain harmony within the placement, navigating what a divided loyalty between the authority figures in my life and figuring out what filial piety means for a child without their family from a Chinese culture. This responsibility needs to sit with well-informed practitioners who understand the cultural context, who have the research available to them, and who are curious about how this cultural context frames the different relationships a child and young person has with people around them in out-of-home care. This means being really clear and proactive early on, like we touched on in the previous slide, about what out-of-home care is, its purpose, what the carer's role is, especially around forming judgments around why a child might have been removed and how cultural identity is going to be supported in the placement. It means that caseworkers need to support carers to explore their own assumptions. So touching on that reflexivity that the previous presentation looked at, and removing the child or young person as the translator or mediator in that role. Carers need to be supported to understand what cultural connection looks like, both the tangible and intangible aspects, and what it should also look like for a child or young person who's still figuring out their own identity. This is because cultural diversity strengthens placements. It acts as a protective factor against some of the outcomes that we see after out-of-home care. But it also shouldn't come at the cost of a child or a young person who needs to carry that relational burden. Looking at number 3. Now, this one's a bit of a personal reflection. Looking at my years that I spent in out-of-home care in all different types of placements, I feel like, as dramatic as this sounds, I've experienced probably a bit of a renaissance in terms of my cultural identity. I feel like now I consciously engage with so many aspects of my culture and background. When I was in care, I spoke about culture from a really singular viewpoint. Culture looked like tangible manifestations of what people who looked like me physically did. So that looks like, Chinese food, the language I grew up speaking. And I guess the goal of that was to assimilate and belong to the others around me in care. And without any further exposure to anything else, I found it really difficult to extend beyond this viewpoint. Now, my engagement looks a lot more like trying to achieve different goals. I look at contemporary discourse. I engage with Chinese popular culture. I share the food I enjoy with the people around me, whether they are Chinese or not. And it's all about broadening my own knowledge and creating a cultural identity that's also merged with my identity as someone who's grown up and lives in Australia as well. So now just looking at some key takeaways, I think number 1, and this is so important, is being curious about someone's culture. Compliance is there to remind us of our core roles and responsibilities as practitioners in the out-of-home care space and as caseworkers. But genuine advocacy can't be achieved without meaningful relationships with carers and with children and young people. Whether those are with yourself as a caseworker or another member of your own community, the only way to identify who that person you can have a meaningful connection with is through speaking with them to understand their perspective. And engaging in dialogue with a children or young person means adding not only to your own knowledge, but also adding to their knowledge. It's reciprocal. And when someone is interested and wants to look at what you enjoy or find uncomfortable or learn about them further, that's really a unique sense of curiosity you get as a child or young person in out-of-home care. Looking at number 2, and this is something that's often raised, I find, is around disengagement. Disengagement is discouraging to your work. Persistence and pushing a child or young person to constantly engage is something that's really difficult to sustain, particularly if it's a repeated rejection response that you're getting. But children and young people aren't trying to disrupt your job or make it difficult. They're just in a space where their identity might be so fractured and fragmented that it's difficult to even comprehend what contributing to a cultural care plan looks like when they have other more pressing concerns. And the last one is, I guess, something a bit more personal from me, and that's that trying to belong to the majority or to the people around you doesn't give you much benefit besides limited security. When you're empowered by those around you to construct your own identity, it's a different feeling to be able to feel pride and confidence about who you are. And I guess quickly end with a quick personal reflection. I wish I was able to appreciate all the aspects on the slide just before this as I grew up, but I'm now committed to, I guess, ensuring that I do my best to represent what something as a concept that's so abstract, such as culture, can look like, and what its inextricable link with identity might look like as well.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you to Rebekah and Kathy as well for great presentations. Just going to now, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, so I'm just going to move across to Marg, and Marg's just going to talk for a couple of minutes around the opportunities and challenges associated with implementation.
Hi everyone. Look, I am going to keep it quite brief and just touch on a couple of things. So I think from an implementation perspective, we need to acknowledge that implementation is a dynamic, ongoing, active process. It's not a set and forget. So if we're not going to think about implementing the guide in that way, we're kind of setting ourselves up problematically in the first place. So 3 things really quickly I'll talk to. And one is, I guess, is if we don't have organisational readiness, so if we're not considering or assessing our organisational readiness, we really want to be able to do that in an effective way. So we want to think about how we're going to go about implementing the guide. We want to have a look at what we're already doing well within our organisation, spotting areas for improvement, and then planning what support is needed for change. A really primary driver for that would be having leadership buy-in and having them championing of this whole approach. So we need leaders facilitating feedback loops. We need them to be identifying barriers and enablers, and allowing timely support to address any challenges or barriers that are going to get in the way of practitioners being able to implement this as business as usual, which then leads me to sort of practitioner support. So if we want a capable and compatible workforce, and we want to see behaviour change, because what we're asking is, we're not just asking practitioners to do something new, we might be asking them to do something differently. So we need our organisations and our leaders to model and prioritise the time it takes to be able to embed this into their day-to-day work. There's a whole lot more we could talk to about that, but I'm going to move on to some of the, I think, opportunities we have with the C4 as a practice guide, but also a bit of a bridge to already existing practice. So I guess, again, it's about remembering that this isn't intended to replace existing tools. It's to, or it's not a separate or a new initiative. And I think just the way we speak to that helps to hopefully reduce the burden on practitioners carrying all the weight in being able to implement this well and to sustain it over time. So it's designed to complement and enhance the existing tools that we have, like those cultural care plans and life story work. It's also a great fit for purpose reflective practice resource. So it's designed really to support practitioners. It's got great examples of open-ended questions, curious questions, so it can be used in supervision. It could be used in coaching, team learning opportunities to help build cultural humility over time. It's also a great resource that can strengthen governance. So if we've already got good cultural governance structures in place, that's fantastic. Again, this is just to enhance and add on to what might already be there. The guide also includes really useful prompts for monitoring and oversight. So thinking about data collection, reporting, access to training, and really understanding children's experience of cultural care. And then again, just due to time, I guess the end goal is for us to really weave this into our organisation's everyday processes. So ongoing monitoring and evaluation are important, but also important and paramount is that ongoing support for practitioners. This is about improving the quality of conversations and collaborations about cultural connections for children from diverse backgrounds. And importantly, it's about keeping cultural practice at the forefront, moving beyond token gestures and ensuring genuine engagement. So from an implementation perspective, remembering that it's not just set and forget, it's not a linear process. We really want to be adapting, responsive, and fit for each individual local context as well. So I hope that's helpful and not too rushed.
Thanks, Marg. Look, I hope everybody, people can stay on for another maybe 5 or 10 minutes, because Ghassan is going to talk a little bit now for a few minutes around embedding culture in everyday practice. Thanks, Ghassan.
Thanks, Marion, and thanks everyone for this great presentation as well. So regarding embedding culture in everyday practice, I'll be very quick because most of it had been covered as well in the previous comments. So it is mainly regarding for us to shift our mentality from culture being an add-on to everyday practice to be essential to our casework. So it's really important for this because it's not an add-on. If we know how to do it well and if we consider it as essential for our everyday practice, it's really important. So if we think about the cultural practice continuum, which is like from the cultural destructiveness and ending up with cultural proactiveness. With the cultural destructiveness, it is very, very toxic because it destroys cultures and it tries to diminish everyone. While proactiveness, it is the co-design, it is the being responsive, being a leader with advocating and changing and influencing practices. So it's really important to see how we can do it and the culture is intentionally sustained. So with this, it's as well, it is a dynamic continuum. That means a caseworker can be on one of these because it is from the destructiveness to proactiveness, but in between them, it is the blindness, it is the pre-competence, it is the awareness to all this. So the caseworker can be with one family on one thing, but on the other family on a different. So it's really important that the caseworkers reflect where they sit along this continuum with every single family when working with a with anyone, and how they can move forward the continuum. Really important with this, and with and we always say this is regarding my staff, for example, or as the sector is culturally aware. Cultural awareness is really important, but it is the starting point of the culture, how we implement culture, because it is, we are aware of differences, but it is really important that we apply the practice consistently. With cultural awareness sits tokenism. So because we apply it, but it is not consistent, it is not always like ongoingly. So it's really important. Tokenism happens when we have symbolic things, one meal, one photo, one event, without continuity or relationships. That we avoid this by shifting from activities to relationships. So we do not need to be doing this activity like that. Activities to relationship. From assumptions, we need to curiosity. How can we ask questions? What can we do differently? From doing culture, and Teresa, what you said, from doing culture to practicing cultural humility. So this is really important. And a simple test we always use, would this still happen if no one had to document it? So we are visiting a family and we are doing this. So in our head, all right, everything's in place. Or so if the answer is no to this, that means culture is not fully embedded and we need to do it differently. And the example of, for example, from doing culture, from assumption to curiosity, example, a carer, instead of cooking or preparing a food for the child, a cultural food, it's not about learning what food the child eats, but it is about understanding why certain food matters, for example, and ensuring it's part of regular routines, not just special occasions. And I cannot talk right now about the cultural newsletter because it is in the in the document that had been provided to you. So you will see as well, like our approach regarding the cultural newsletter and the resources, what we need to be, how we're going to be supporting our carers with this. It is like when we do this, we can see culture is as a protective factor. Really important. It's not as a especially we see some practices where culture is, for example, family time or community is like, this is a risk. Instead of addressing this as a risk, how can we address this as a protective factor and put support around this? My last thing is regarding, and we are always asked these questions, and I'll do it very, very briefly regarding whose responsibility is this. So it is everyone's responsibility, and the roles are not are very structured and are not vague at all. The carers, they play the role of support. They support the culture in everyday life by cooking food, by doing this, by being proactive if the child is facing racism or so the carers play the support role. The parents and extended family contribute by sharing their stories. So they give what's, it's really important for this, and they maintain the pride of the child, even if they are separated from them. Community and faith networks, and this is really important, they provide belonging beyond the placement. If we are having, if that child is not having a community connection, belonging doesn't exist at all. And agencies and caseworkers, they hold the system together. We hold it together and we ensure that everyone is, every single one is in place. And of course, we have the child who is at the center of everything. And at what stage that child wants to have connection with the culture? Is it because of their trauma? Is it because, and as well, we need to unpack it further and to link the culture to everyone. So when these roles are aligned and sustained over time, culture is not something a child visits. It becomes part of how they live, belong, and feel safe every day. And the child voice would direct this. The last thing is about creating the village. And with this, it is about mapping the real people in that child's life, like family, community, faith, mentors, siblings, and turning those connections into predictable routines. Because if we do not have predictable routines, that means the child is living the culture naturally. It cannot be that means we are doing just some task instead of a just natural environment. So when connection is regular, relational, and culture stops being a task and become a lived experience. I hope that I didn't touch much. I wanted to talk about the settlement and how to integrate the settlement research with the placement, but we can do it in a different way.
Thank you, Ghassan, and thank you, everybody. So just very quickly, if we just go around each presenter, what's the one takeaway message that you'd like to just leave those still online with? So Kathy, did you want to, or Rebekah?
Yeah, for me, it's about outcomes. It's about it's our responsibility for those involved in the sector and carers to give children the opportunity for information so that they can have choice around how to live and weave it into their lives.
For me, it's about culture being unique for every individual child. So taking the time to understand what it means and what's important to each individual child. That's probably a key message from me.
Teresa?
I think for me, that looks like increased engagement and a willingness to speak to a child and be curious about their thoughts and their perspective.
Thanks. Marg, did you have a key takeaway?
I do. For me, it would be organisational infrastructure. So ensuring that organisations and leaders prioritise and are set up to enable practitioners to do this really meaningful work.
Thank you. And Ghassan?
Thank you. I think for me, when culture is embedded into our daily practice, it becomes a way of living, and it's not something we do when time allows, and outcomes improve.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you today. It's been fantastic, and the response has been just so positive in the chat, and with pity that we couldn't go for longer, I think. But anyone who's registered, of course, will receive the link of the webinar. And we'd just like to invite everybody to our next Lunch and Learn, which will be held on Thursday, the 21st of May. And we'll be looking at understanding and responding to workplace trauma for frontline workers. So an invitation will come out later this week, I think. Anyway, have a great day, everybody. And thanks again to our wonderful presenters. Thank you.